the US military is having to struggle to keep up with advances that China has developed over the past decade or two, which in many ways were quite foreseeable, but because of ideological blinders that American policymakers had, weren't really taken seriously.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David J. Lynch, global economics correspondent here at the Post. Today we have two segments on American economic competitiveness. Later, we'll be joined by Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton, a member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. But first, historian Chris Miller will join us to talk about the global semiconductor industry. Chris is the author of the terrific new book, Chip War, and also an associate professor of international history at Tufts University. Chris Miller, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with let's start at the beginning with some very basic facts. For folks who hear about semiconductors, computer chips, microchips, just what is a semiconductor? What does it do? And why are they so important?
So a chip is a small piece of silicon that has millions or billions of tiny circuits carved into them. And these circuits flip on and off, producing all of the ones and zeros undergirding all computing. So most data storage, all processing comes from these little circuits turning on and off. And today chips are in all types of devices. It's not only smartphones or PCs that have chips inside of them, but also dishwashers, automobiles, coffee makers, and most importantly of all, data centers, which increasingly process and remember our data in vast quantities. And the modern economy has reached a situation where it just can't function without access to thousands and thousands of semiconductors that we rely on every single day.
And so as you explain in Chip War, this industry began in the United States. Wasn't that long ago that we dominated manufacturing of semiconductors, but the U.S. lost its lead, and quite dramatically so. How did it happen?
Well, today there are only 3 companies in the world that are close to the ability to produce cutting-edge processor chips. One of them is a U.S. firm, Intel, but it's fallen a bit behind technologically compared to 2 foreign firms, TSMC of Taiwan and Samsung of South Korea. And it's in Taiwan where 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips are manufactured. Chips that go into your smartphone, into PCs, into data centers. And the Taiwanese have succeeded for several reasons. First off, TSMC was founded with a unique business model. It doesn't design any chips, it only manufactures them, letting it create extraordinary efficiencies in its manufacturing process. In addition to that, the Taiwanese have also learned how to drive down the cost of chip making. And today, it's estimated that a new chip making facility will cost 20% or so less in Taiwan than it does in the United States. And the cost differential, coupled with the unique capabilities of TSMC, have led to a dramatic decline in U.S. market share when it comes to manufacturing semiconductors.
And this is also a very globalized supply chain for chips. As we saw here during the pandemic, a shortage of semiconductors really disrupted auto production and other industries, leading to serious product delays. What are the key global choke points in this global supply chain? Where are the potential kinks in the chain?
Well, there are a number of steps in the supply chain that produce chips where there's just one country or a couple of companies with relevant capabilities. A lot of the precise machine tools needed to manufacture advanced chips are produced by just a handful of companies, largely in the US, Japan, or the Netherlands. The software tools needed to design chips are largely produced in the US. But the primary risk today, the concern hanging over the chip industry, is that most chip manufacturing happens in East Asia, and a disproportionate share of the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors happens in Taiwan. And as the Chinese military continues to threaten Taiwan's security, worries that chip supply out of Taiwan might be disrupted have grown.
And so does the existence of these kind of weak spots or again, choke points, does that represent to some degree a failure of U.S. policy over the years, or is it simply a function of the inherent structure of this industry?
Well, I think it's a mix of both. There are clearly huge economies of scale in the chip industry, which is why at many parts of the manufacturing process, there's only a couple of very large firms that are capable of producing cutting edge technology. And these economies of scale are built into the way the industry functions. But I think it's also a policy error. If you'd asked any US policymaker 20 years ago, would they feel comfortable with a chip industry in which 90% of the most advanced chips were produced in one country, also a country that happens to be the world's most dangerous political hotspot? Most policymakers would have said no. And yet we found ourselves in this situation because there wasn't sufficient foresight among policymakers to understand where industry trends were headed and where trends in relations between China and Taiwan were headed.
Right. And the Biden administration now, perhaps belatedly on behalf of the U.S., is trying to do something about this, trying to repatriate or encourage at least domestic manufacturing of semiconductors through the bipartisan CHIPS Act, which provides about $39 billion in subsidies to encourage domestic manufacturing, another 10 or 11 billion in R&D spending. It's an incredibly ambitious effort on behalf of U.S. industry of the kind that we really haven't seen in quite some time. There are already some mixed views as to its prospects for success. Morris Chang, who I know you know, the founder of Taiwan's TSMC, has called the CHIPS Act, quote, a wasteful and expensive exercise in futility, close quote. What's your view of it? Is he right?
Well, I don't think he's right. I think the right way to look at the CHIPS Act is as an insurance policy. It's certainly going to be expensive, but it would be a lot more expensive to have a Chinese attack or blockade on Taiwan in the absence of efforts to rebuild chip making capacity elsewhere. And so I think if you look at the CHIPS Act in the US, similar efforts in Europe, Japan, India, and other countries, what you see is globally there's a desire by many governments to rebalance the semiconductor supply chain and to add a bit more geographic diversification in case something goes wrong in the Taiwan Straits and China escalates militarily. It's probably not the most likely option. China is probably going to be deterred from attacking Taiwan, but the cost of a Chinese attack would be catastrophic. We'd see Great Depression levels of disruption to global manufacturing. And so I think the CHIPS Act has to be seen as an effort to insure ourselves against this very dangerous risk.
And of course, this isn't the first time that the industry has called on Washington for special assistance. As you tell the story in Chip War back in the 1980s, there was a venture called Semitech. Explain to our viewers how these two initiatives differ and what sort of success or failure Semitech resulted in.
Well, Semitech was created in the late 1980s, intended to improve manufacturing technology capabilities among US firms. At the time, they were facing a lot of competition from companies in Japan. And Semitech was mixed in terms of its efficacy. There were a number of efforts that Semitech undertook, including most of the efforts that consumed majority of the budget that didn't work. Efforts to fund certain types of new chip making tool development, for example, where its success rate was pretty low. There were other impacts that Semitech had that were more positive. For example, it brought together companies in the chip industry and had them agree on the future pathway for technological development so that the tool makers could introduce new tools at a time when chip makers were ready to integrate these tools into the manufacturing processes. But in aggregate, I think Semitech was a disappointment. And the challenge that we face now is to produce better results this time. I think a key difference, though, between Semitech in the 1980s and the CHIPS Act now is the focus on manufacturing incentives. Congress passed the CHIPS Act because they realized that it was more expensive to produce chips in the United States and that this cost differential was driving manufacturing offshore. And so the CHIPS Act is intended to reduce that cost differential, make it more commercially viable to produce chips in the United States.
I want to drill down on a couple of those points a little bit later, but first I want to bring in a question from the audience. A viewer in Washington, D.C. asks how a U.S. manufacturing renaissance will be possible amid a labor shortage due to retiring baby boomers, declining birth rates, and hostility toward immigration. What do you think about the workforce part of this equation?
Well, I think workforce development is going to be a key challenge. Now, it always is in the chip industry. The chip industry has, from its earliest days, focused on attracting workers from the university level all the way on through PhD programs, drawing them into the chip industry. And it's got a pretty good track record of establishing the talent pipelines that it needs. But certainly there's more focus than ever on making sure there are clear pathways from educational institutions into chip firms that will provide the workforce that's necessary. I think on the question of immigration, there's a lot that ought to be done to facilitate the access by chip makers in the US to foreign talent. And one of the challenges that's faced is that there's a limited number of H-1B visas, for example, each year, which makes it harder for chip makers to hire skilled workers from abroad. If Congress were to fix that, that would certainly make a difference in the chip industry's ability to address the talent issues that they face.
Could you talk a little bit about the types of jobs that are actually going to be created in some of these major facilities that we're already seeing investment announcements, Intel in Ohio, Micron in upstate New York, IBM as well. The administration has, of course, pitched these as sort of bringing back American manufacturing. But for folks who've been laid off from plants in Ohio or New York or elsewhere in the Midwest, how applicable are the skills for a typical manufacturing worker to what's required in one of these semiconductor facilities?
Well, I think it's natural and to be expected that political leaders will cast programs like this as job creation programs, but the reality is that that was never the intent of the CHIPS Act, nor will it be the primary impact. There are a moderate number of employees in a typical chip making facility, several thousand, but the CHIPS Act's success or failure shouldn't be measured in terms of the jobs it creates. It's not going to be efficient as a job creation program because the chip industry requires huge capital investment relative to the number of workers in facilities. So I think as analysts, we can sort of set aside the political rhetoric about job creation. This is an insurance policy designed to build up manufacturing capacity in case something goes wrong in Asia.
Now, some have also criticized the administration for trying to add on additional objectives to what was intended to be a very focused program to develop new semiconductor capacity. And one measure designed to encourage the provision of childcare facilities by companies receiving the subsidies has gotten a lot of attention. The administration says this is not us trying to, get cute and achieve a social goal that we couldn't get through Congress. This is actually needed to broaden the potential pipeline of workers coming in. Republicans on the Hill say, no, this is just the administration trying to sneak something through that they couldn't pass legislatively. How do you see this child care issue?
I think if you look at the child care issue or some of the other issues that have gotten media headlines, for example, the green energy requirements, some of the information sharing between firms and the government, what you find is that a lot of them are preferences that the Commerce Department has stated rather than requirements. And when companies apply for funds via the CHIPS Act, that sets off a period of negotiations between companies and the government about the specifics of a deal. Will the government invest in a project, and if so, under what terms? And so I think we should expect that the government will continue to express a preference for having companies provide childcare. But I also think that when we get into the details of negotiations between companies and the government, there will be real questions to be asked about what is commercially viable to provide, what types of provisions can be cost effectively added on to these deals. And I think the team negotiating the chip incentives at the Commerce Department are actually likely to be laser focused on the question of can they get major increases in manufacturing capacity at the lowest cost possible. And insofar as they keep focusing on that, I think we're probably not going to see actually childcare issues or green energy issues or any of the other issues that have sparked controversy getting in the way of deals that need to be done.
You mentioned earlier that a key goal here is to bring down the cost of building these new semiconductor facilities in the U.S. Can that be accomplished without major reform of the permitting process at both the federal and state level? Isn't that one of the key contributors to higher costs?
It's a huge issue. You're absolutely right. And today it takes longer to build a chip making facility in the US, not only compared to Taiwan or to Korea or to China, but even to Europe, which is not known as an area with light touch permitting regulation. So we certainly need permitting reform at the federal level. But also, as you say, at state and local levels, which are often just as onerous. And it's not simply a question of what are the regulatory burdens imposed, but also how rapidly are those worked through? Because the chip industry requires extraordinary levels of capital investment to build a new plant. And so every day that a plant is still not up and running imposes huge costs because the equipment's already been paid for. And so getting permitting streamlined at both the state, local, and federal levels is very important. Now, that's an issue that's not really in the hands of the Commerce Department. That requires action from Congress at the federal level and action from state and local governments. But it's a big issue that the CHIPS Act has not yet fully addressed, and we need to see more action from the government to streamline these processes.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the U.S.-China angle here. China's been trying for most of the last decade to develop its own domestic semiconductor manufacturing capabilities without a great deal of success thus far. Why is that, and what lessons, if any, do you draw from the Chinese experience?
Well, I don't really know that there are a lot of lessons that are directly applicable to the US. I think the two problems that China has faced are, first off, they don't have access to many of the most advanced chip making tools, which are produced in the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. And so it's hard to produce advanced chips without chip making tools that are necessary for the manufacturing. That's a problem the US is not going to have. The second issue is that the Chinese government has invested its vast subsidies in chip making very, very poorly. Because it's never been focused on commercial viability. It's been focused on simply building out manufacturing capacity. And so I don't think we're likely to see the Commerce Department fall into a similar trap. They've been requesting lots of information from potential applicants precisely because they want to be funding facilities that will be commercially viable. Whereas in China, there's never been a focus on commercial viability. It's just been capacity that's been the primary focus of policymakers.
Now, last October, the Biden administration issued new regulations prohibiting the export to China of our most advanced semiconductors, and importantly, the equipment used to make them. Administration officials have said that this was done purely on national security grounds, just an effort to keep China from catching up militarily or perhaps even leapfrogging us with some advanced weaponry. But of course, the semiconductors at issue here, as I understand it, are dual use technologies, and what can be used for AI or quantum computing with military applications also has commercial applications as well. Is this U.S. effort purely aimed at national security, or is it designed to hold China back economically as well?
No, it is aimed at national security, but it will have an impact economically because the exact same chips that can train AI systems for military use are also used to train AI systems for civilian use. It's the same principles that train a car to drive autonomously, that train a drone to fly autonomously. And there's just a couple of firms that make these chips, almost all American firms designing them, and one Taiwanese firm manufacturing them. And so these controls are a major change in U.S. policy because they're not specifically focused on military uses. They can't be because the chips are widely used both for military and civilian uses. So they will end up having a major impact on Chinese civilian tech sector too.
Now, cooperation from U.S. allies is critical to making this sort of a ban work, and the Japanese and Dutch, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, have signed on to the U.S. effort. What do you make of that? Were you surprised by it? And how do you think the U.S. pulled that off?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it is surprising. If you look at Japan, they're in the process of doubling their defense spending as a share of GDP, precisely because they believe China is a major threat to their security. So in the context of doubling defense spending, chip export controls are a relatively small move in comparison to the change in their military posture. And I think governments across the world are looking at the extraordinarily rapid advances in AI. They're coming to realize the extent to which there's just a couple of companies capable of producing the types of chips that are capable of training AI systems, and realizing that if there's ever going to be an effort to control access to advanced AI systems, chips are going to be a major part of the mechanism in place. So the U.S. strategy to slow down China's AI progress is seen as actually a very sensible strategy in many governments, which are looking very nervously at the military ramifications, very nervous about the intelligence ramifications, and want to have more certainty that the AIs that are being developed in friendly countries first, and that those countries can stay ahead in terms of their technology.
Great. Well, this is an important story, and we'll be following it closely here at the Washington Post. Unfortunately, for now, we are out of time. Chris Miller, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we'll hear from Congressman Seth Moulton, but first, this video.
We chose Bronzeville because of the way the grid is configured here. It was ideal to test a microgrid concept. Siemens is our partner here right from the very start because the technology for those two microgrids to work together seamlessly was provided by Siemens. This microgrid will enable Bronzeville to unplug and replug to the ComEd grid when there's severe weather events. So this will be a lot more resilient type community.
I'm Barbara Humpton, CEO of Siemens USA. Did you know that when the National Academy of Engineering ranked the world's top engineering achievements of the 20th century, they didn't choose spacecraft or automobiles or computers. They chose the electric grid. The idea was that reliable electricity was the great enabler of everything else. In this century, though, we're asking the grid for a lot more, not just to provide our economic backbone, but to help us build a more sustainable, resilient future. And so joining me today is Karen Wayland, CEO of Gridwise Alliance, which serves the electricity industry with a vision to transform the U.S. power grid. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Barbara.
Karen, I want us to explore what's possible now in this decade of action for infrastructure when it comes to grid modernization. I've heard you comment that the grid technologies we need are available. The challenge is that they're being deployed in a patchwork fashion. Help us understand the challenge and share with us how the bipartisan infrastructure law can be part of the solution.
Well, this is really an exciting time for the electricity sector. And we're seeing change across the sector at a rate that's unprecedented in the history of this country's electrification journey. But what's happening is that the transformation is happening, as you mentioned, in a patchwork nature, meaning that in some places where there have been significant investments, the grid is truly a modern grid that has visibility, it has advanced controls, it's able to integrate renewable energy and increase its reliability and resilience. But in other places, these are very expensive investments, and smaller utilities, particularly those in rural areas and smaller cities, are having trouble making those investments. So we're very excited about the infrastructure bill that was passed by Congress last year because it contains billions of dollars to help all utilities and all states and raise the bar on grid modernization and help make those investments and accelerate the transformation.
Well, another area of the bipartisan infrastructure law we're really excited about is the vision to establish a national EV charging network. What are some of the key priorities for grid modernization as we transition to electric vehicles?
That's a great question because the transition to electric vehicles is helping to drive some of the investments for grid modernization. What we need to do is to be able to have a grid that allows grid operators to connect directly with vehicles. And right now, vehicles can plug in and get charged, but ultimately we'd like true vehicle to grid integration, where those vehicles can become resources to the grid and can provide power, can provide resilience, can provide those ancillary benefits, the essential reliability services that we need to keep a stable grid. So it's happening, and we expect that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see an increased number of vehicles, and those vehicles will be able to truly integrate with the grid.
We are seeing a lot of innovation happening right now at the edge of the grid where power meets the end user. How does that change the dynamic of how communities can accelerate sustainability goals and become more resilient?
These grid edge technologies are allowing a much more seamless communication with the resources that a customer might have behind the meter, like rooftop solar, like the batteries on the garage wall or in the vehicle. And what it means is that rather than relying on the bulk power system for all of its power and all of its resources, a local utility can look inward inside its service territory to the services that their customers can provide. And that's a really different way of thinking about how the grid operates, where, for 150 years, we saw one-way flow of electricity and information from the utility to the customer. And now we're seeing an evolution to two-way flow of both electricity and communication back and forth across the grid and between the customer.
Yeah, so in this new world of two-way flow, additional forms of power generation on the grid, the use of vehicles as storage, frankly, the way buildings and transportation systems are going to be interacting with the grid, a lot is changing, and we really appreciate the advocacy of GridWise Alliance, helping our policymakers really work out how to accelerate our progress there. Karen, thanks so much for joining me and for these great insights. And to those watching, if you'd like to learn more about these topics, Karen also joined me recently for a longer conversation on my podcast, The Optimistic Outlook, which you'll find wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks, and I'll turn it back to the Washington Post.
All the studies show if you can get from point A to point B by rail faster than you can by automobile, you take the rail. This is going to be a game changer for the environment as well.
We shouldn't be moving around much more slowly than the rest of the world. The Brits can go 3 times as fast as we can on our interstate system on their new high-speed rail line. Investing in more highways creates more traffic jams. Investing in a lot of electric vehicles makes those traffic jams silent, but we still have a lot of traffic jams. So we have passed this historic infrastructure bill. I think the administration has an opportunity to truly make this investments for the future.
For those of you just joining us, I'm David J. Lynch, Global Economics Correspondent here at the Post. Next up is Congressman Seth Moulton. Congressman, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks, David.
Glad to have you. So President Biden has managed to get 3 major pieces of legislation through Congress that represent the broadest use of industrial policy in decades. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides a lot of clean energy subsidies, and of course the CHIPS Act. Put this in context for our viewers. How big a change is this from the way we've done business here in Washington over the last generation or so?
Well, it is quite a significant change. Our model in America is that we rely on the free market. We rely on the private sector to drive innovation. And in so many ways, that's been key to our success. But when faced with particular national security or economic competitiveness challenges, as we are today with the amount of state subsidies that China is putting into things like their own semiconductor industry. America has often responded with industrial policy. Certainly one of the biggest examples of this was during FDR's presidency, when we funded the Works Progress Administration to help get us out of the Depression. There are also times when we've mobilized industries during our world wars. And the space race is another example of a place where the federal government put a lot of money, much of it going into private sector industry, but the federal government invested to accelerate that development and win a competitive race against one of our adversaries across the globe.
Now, some House Republicans are already trying to reverse the clean energy spending in the showdown over the debt ceiling, which is coming up in the next couple of months. How confident are you that these initiatives, given all the political polarization in Washington, will really represent a lasting change of direction?
Well, there's always some Republicans who are trying to reverse just about anything, because it's a party that at times has really just tried to bring us backwards. The rest of the world is getting ahead of us on the transition to a clean economy, while many members of the Republican Party for a long time were denying the fact that climate change even existed, just simply denying science. So this is going to be a perennial political problem. But I also think that that we are going to continue to make progress. And the progress that has been made under President Biden is truly unprecedented. That will continue even if some Republicans try to diminish pieces of it here and there.
Now, the president also included language in the infrastructure legislation requiring the use of American-made goods and materials in the projects funded through the legislation. The problem in some cases, though, is that some of those materials and goods are no longer made in the United States, and waiting until you've ginned up new domestic suppliers adds cost and can delay some of these projects. How concerned are you about the tension between delivering infrastructure improvements in a timely fashion so that taxpayers can see that this legislation is working, and yet taking time to satisfy the Buy America goals? Aren't these in conflict?
I mean, to be honest, they are in conflict to a certain degree, and this is a concern that we have to work through, because I think we can all agree that we would like things to be made in America. We want the economic benefits from our industries and the parts that we get for other things that we are producing to go to Americans. We want American workers to have jobs. We want American factories to be producing goods that we sell to the world rather than buying everything from China or other places like that. But of course, it's not so simple, right? I mean, we have trade. A trade exists across the world because certain countries have certain advantages, competitive advantages in certain things. And so what we really need to do is figure out the right balance. I don't foresee a world where every single thing is 100% made in America. But at the same time, especially during the pandemic, we recognize the risks that we have when we depend on foreign countries, especially if they're adversaries of ours, for critical supply chains, for the supply of critical goods. And China has made their industrial policy to control rare earth minerals. These are the special, certain things that are mined, these special materials that are mined in only a few places around the globe that are critical for many of our advanced technologies. And so, your iPhone has a lot of rare earth minerals in it, and China controls an extraordinary percentage of the world's supply of these materials, because way back in the 1990s, they recognized that this was going to be an issue, and they developed an industrial policy really connected to their whole national security policy to control these resources around the globe. That's a critical vulnerability for us. If China just decides that they're going to cut off the supply of these rare earth minerals to the United States in the same way that we have cut off the supply of advanced microchips to China, then we're going to be in a world of hurt. And so we have to develop the capacity to produce these rare earth minerals ourselves. That's an example of a place where we want something to be made in America. But does it mean that literally every plastic piece in a car needs to be made here? That's something that's up for debate. And you're right. Ultimately, it comes down to what's the most efficient use of taxpayer resources.
Okay. I want to bring in a question from a member of the audience. Viewer Ron Warwick of New Jersey asks, how will subsidies and central planning affect the efficiency of subsidized industries? And are we just trading supply stability and social justice engineering for higher prices? What would you say to Ron?
Well, look, the reason why America has thrived on a free market economy, with the innovation of the private sector driving our success for most of the history of this nation, is because we recognize that that these are risks, right? That if you just heavily subsidize an industry and you're not thoughtful about how we use those subsidies, that it can produce inefficiencies, that prices can go up, and efficiencies of production go down. And so that's a risk with any of these policies. But I think if you look carefully at the CHIPS and Science Act, and you look carefully at how the administration, particularly the Commerce Department, intends to implement this legislation, they're taking a lot of these factors into consideration. We're not just building factories with this taxpayer money. We're providing grants to help private companies build these factories. Usually only about 15% of a factory's cost will come from this bill, but that 15% might be enough to make the investment worthwhile, to justify building a factory in the United States that otherwise a company might have looked to build in Asia, for example. So I think that these are real risks, and I acknowledge that. But we're being very thoughtful both in how the legislation was written and then how the administration is implementing it to minimize those risks to the American taxpayer.
Now, the administration has also been criticized for what some on Capitol Hill say is losing focus with some of these major initiatives. With the CHIPS Act, some of the contracting preferences have included a provision for child care on behalf of the companies receiving subsidies. Likewise, just today, the president's expected to sign an executive order that would direct all federal agencies to investigate whether they can require the recipients of all sorts of federal money, including perhaps the infrastructure funding, to provide affordable child care. Is that something that you think is a good idea? Does the president have the authority to direct through executive action something of this sort that he wasn't able to secure legislatively?
Well, I think he does have that authority. And if you're asking me whether I think affordable childcare is a good thing for the country, it's a wholehearted yes, absolutely. Affordable childcare gets more people into the workforce and fundamentally strengthens our economy. And look, candidly, if the biggest criticism that the White House can get on this legislation is losing focus, I mean, this just shows how much the critics are reduced to nitpicking here. This is not a big deal. Yes, I think in this example, having affordable childcare is a good policy for the United States of America, and it will improve the economic results of this legislation. But it is a very minor part of the grand scheme of things when we talk about the bill and the effects that it will have.
Okay, I want to talk about high-speed rail, which I know you know something about. Before being elected to Congress, you worked for a time on a project down in Texas that I believe was trying to connect Dallas and Houston.
Still trying.
And I was just going to say, 10 years later, it's still a great idea, and maybe it'll always be a great idea. But it's not the only high-speed rail project that's actually moved at a snail's pace, right? The San Francisco to Los Angeles connection out in California has now become notorious for extra costs and delays that have really called into question its viability. What's the problem with these projects? Why can Europe and Asia manage to do this more or less as a matter of course, and the United States, for some reason, can't really seem to get any of it accomplished? What's the problem?
Great question. Well, there are two fundamental problems. The first is that for decades in America, we have poured billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies into highways and airports, and we've given absolutely nothing to high-speed rail. And so there's a fundamental imbalance here where the rest of the world looks at transportation problems and says, what's the most economical way? What's the best return on investment for solving a transportation problem between two cities? The answer is often high-speed rail. You know, there's not some vast rail conspiracy in the rest of the world that just hasn't infected America. These other countries are making wise decisions about transportation policy based on business and market realities, where in the United States, we just say, no, you're not allowed to invest in high-speed rail. We don't even have a federal high-speed rail policy. We're just going to continue subsidizing highways and airports, which in many cases are not the most efficient option. The second issue is, even if we do decide to build high-speed rail, or frankly, if we build a lot of different infrastructure projects in the United States, they seem to cost a lot more than similar projects in the rest of the world. And there's not a simple answer for that. One of the issues is that we have this really landmark environmental legislation called the National Environmental Policy Act from the 1970s. It's very well intended. It's done a lot to protect our environment. But when years of delays are incurred in a high-speed rail project, something that's fundamentally very good for the environment because of the lengthy NEPA process. And by the way, all this money is just going to lawyers and consultants. It's not actually really going to building the high-speed rail line. Then all of a sudden, doing the same project in the United States becomes much more expensive than doing the same project overseas. That's one example of where we've got to really look carefully at the bureaucracy around these infrastructure projects and really learn some lessons from other countries and how they're able to do them more efficiently.
Yeah, I want to ask you about permitting reform because, as you say, it does seem to be a problem of environmental review, at least in the legal system, run amok. But you know, environmental objectives and transportation objectives are at odds there for the Democrats. And is a Democratic president, are Democratic members of Congress willing to say, you know, we've got to do a little bit less on the environmental side in order to achieve these other objectives? I mean, because that does involve taking on one of your key constituencies, doesn't it?
Well, I'm a huge environmentalist. I'm also one of the only members of Congress with a degree in science, so I very much understand the importance of all of this. But I think that where the opportunity for political compromise is to say, you know, let's look at lessening the NEPA requirements for a project that is fundamentally good for the environment, like all electric high-speed rail gets a lot of people not only out of their cars by giving them another option, or out of fuming planes by giving them another option, but also incentivizes the kind of urban centers with walkable communities that are just much more sustainable sustainable growth. So there are multiple levels at which high-speed rail is better for the environment, not just direct emissions, but in all the other things about how we live and how we get to train stations and things like that that affect our overall environmental picture. So we should be able to step back and say, look, if this is fundamentally good for the environment, then why are all these projects getting delayed and costs rising exponentially because of the environmental reviews? Now, look, on the other hand, if the environmental review process is holding up a major highway expansion, then that's probably a good thing, because expanding highways is not only a terribly inefficient way to move people. Most highway expansions in the United States in the last 20 years have actually resulted in more congestion, literally going more slowly on our highways. And we can get into that in more detail. But the bottom line is that these highway expansions are terrible for the environment. They take up an extraordinary amount of land. They increase emissions, they increase congestion. And so if the environmental review process makes us scrutinize those projects, then that's absolutely the right thing to do.
Now, much of what's driving this push for industrial policy, certainly on the CHIPS Act, is concern over competition from China. You're a member of the new House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China. Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin, a rising star in the GOP, is the panel's chairman. He said he really wants a bipartisan effort through this committee. What do you make of the panel's work so far, and why did you want to be part of it?
Well, so far it's been very bipartisan. And I praise not only Chairman Gallagher and ranking member Krishnamurthy on the committee, but also the House leadership on both sides of the aisle, Kevin McCarthy and Hakeem Jeffries, for really making an effort to make this a serious bipartisan committee. We have an impressive group of members who represent a lot of different backgrounds, not only national security, but economic issues in manufacturing, financial services issues that are bringing their wealth of knowledge and a really diverse set of viewpoints to this committee. The reason why it's so important is because we want at all costs, we want to avoid a war with China. And when Xi Jinping says that he intends to invade Taiwan, and we've made it very clear that Taiwan is an ally, a friend, and we want to see democracy preserved on the island, then this sets up a very dangerous situation between China and the United States, where China could launch a war, an illegal war, just like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that draws the U.S. in. And let me just tell you, it would be catastrophic compared to what we're seeing in Ukraine. I mean, you could wake up tomorrow and have 2 U.S. aircraft carriers at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean with 10,000 young Americans down there with them. I mean, the cost of a war with China would be extraordinary. And yet when China says they want to start a war, we have to really step up our deterrence. It's not just military deterrence, it's economic deterrence. It's really having a sophisticated geopolitical diplomatic strategy with our allies in the region to make the case to Xi Jinping that this is a bad idea. And if we ultimately succeed in deterring and preventing a war with China in the Pacific, I think there's no more important thing that I could be doing in Congress today.
Great. Now, the mood in Washington toward China has really shifted in recent years. After 40 years of engagement, there's a real bipartisan antipathy toward China. Where do you think, looking back, that U.S. policy toward China began to go wrong, and what was the fundamental mistake?
Well, look, the reason for the change is very simple. Xi Jinping has said that he wants to invade Taiwan, and he's made that very clear. And he has not only said that publicly, but he said that privately. And if you look at the way that they're investing in their military, the way they're investing in even things like building up their domestic semiconductor capacity, I mean, this is all geared towards this absolutely terrible foreign policy objective that this autocrat Xi Jinping seems to think is important for his legacy, in very much the same way that Vladimir Putin has tied taking over Ukraine to his legacy. Now, there are a lot of differences between Russia and China, but in terms of the territorial ambitions of their autocratic leaders, they're very much aligned. So that is why U.S. policy has shifted. I'm not sure that we were wrong to engage with China before, that we were wrong to engage with China under a different regime, that we developed economic ties, and the real hope that developing those tight economic ties would actually help bring China more towards Western values and democracy. That was a very legitimate foreign policy position, and I think it was a wise course for the United States to take. But because China has changed its ambitions, China has really set up this contest between autocracies and democracies across the world. The Chinese Communist Party oppresses people not only at home, but all over the globe. We just saw 2 people arrested in New York City, Chinese spies, for running a Chinese police station, a Chinese Communist Party police station in the United States of America. I mean, this is absurd. But this has all happened under Xi Jinping. And so we've had to change our policy and our stance towards China as a result.
Well, I have many more questions about U.S.-China relations. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Congressman Seth Moulton, thanks very much for being with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks, David.
And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. If you want to see what other programs we have coming up, please head over to WashingtonPostLive.com. I'm David J. Lynch, Global Economics Correspondent here at the Post. Thanks again.